Today we're looking at the reteach for 8-3 of solving right triangles, and we're going to be looking at our trigonometric ratios. Remember to use that SOHCAHTOA to help you remember which ratio to use. So we're always thinking of that SOHCAHTOA. If we're looking at the trig ratio, here for the example that they've given us with a right triangle with legs 6 and 8 and a hypotenuse of 10, if we have angle 1 and angle 2, if we want the sine of angle 1, we know we're looking at that we're looking at the opposite to the hypotenuse, so I'm looking at 6 over 10, and if I took that as a decimal, it'll be 0.6. If I want the sine of angle 2, I want the opposite side to angle 2, which is my 8 over my hypotenuse 10, 8/10, 0.8. So I'm taking a look at finding my angles. It says if I'm looking to figure out which angle was angle A, I know that angle A was the same as the sine of 2, so angle 2 is equal to my A. If I know the sine, cosine, tangent, then I can figure out what the measure of the angle is. If I know that the sine of A is equal to some fraction x, I can take the inverse sine of that fraction x to get the measure of the angle A. I use that inverse button by going to second sine. So I hit my second button, then my sine, or my second button, then my cosine, or my second button, and then my tangent. On your calculator, you can see those functions. Listed in blue above your sine, cosine, tangent buttons, that inverse button. So you're hitting your blue button sine, your blue button cosine, your blue button tangent. Please make sure that the mode of your calculator is in degrees. So you're going to your mode button, going down to radians, over to degrees, and highlighting that. If I'm taking a look at knowing my trig ratios to determine which angle is angle A. First, I've got some strange decimal approximations here, so let's figure out what kind of ratios we might have. We might have a ratio of the 3 over 6, or the 5.2 over 6, or the 3 over 5.2, or the 5.2 over 3, depending on what we're looking at. If I'm looking at that ratio of 3 over 6, I know that reduces to 1/2. If I'm looking at the ratio of 5.2 over 6, I can't tell by looking at that what would be the reduced fraction, so I'd go ahead and put that in my calculator, 5.2 divided by 6, and hit my math enter button to get 13/15. So if I'm using my sine or cosine functions, I'll either have the 3 over the hypotenuse 6 or the 5.2 over the hypotenuse 6 for my sines and cosines. If I'm looking for a tangent function, for problem number 4, I might have either the 3 over 5.2, and I could figure that fraction out. 3 over 5.2, math, enter, is 15/26. Or I could have the tangent ratio of 5.2 over 3, which would be the reciprocal of that number. So having those numbers worked out in this problem is going to help us out. If I look at question number 1, I want the sine of angle A, the 1/2. So if I'm looking at my fractions, I'm looking at this. The 1/2 is when I had the 3 over 6. I need 3 to be the opposite side. I know 6 is my hypotenuse. Opposite the angles, notice that the 3 is next to the 1 or adjacent to it. It's opposite the 2. So I know that angle A is angle 2. That's what they're asking us to find. If I look at question number 2, the cosine of angle A, 13/15, that's the 5.2/6. Cosine, that ka, is adjacent over hypotenuse, so I want the side that's adjacent to the 5.2, the angle adjacent. Adjacent to angle 2 is my length of 5.2, so I know that in this case angle A is also angle 2. If I look at question number 3, where I want the cosine to be 0.5, 0.5 is the same as 1/2, so I'm looking at my fraction 3/6. I want that to be adjacent over hypotenuse. If I want 3/6, I want 3 to be next to, adjacent to an angle. I know that angle A has to be the same as angle 1. And if I'm looking at the fraction for my tangent of 15/26, and I go back up here when I found those decimals, reduced fractions rather, I know that's going to be my 3/5.2. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. If I want 3/5.2, I want 3 to be my opposite, 5.2 to be adjacent, and so that gives me that angle A has to be angle 2. Questions 5, 6, 7, and 8 are just number crunching, where you're using your inverse button, which means you're using that second button to find that, and you're just putting these in your calculator. Please make sure before you do these that the mode of your calculator is in degrees. If your mode's not in degrees, you won't get the right answer for those questions. So if I'm trying to find the inverse sine of 0.8, I hit my second button, then my sine button, that gives me that inverse sine. I want 0.8. I close, enter, and I end up with an angle of 53 degrees. In the same way, you should have gotten your other answers. Double check. If you did not get those answers, then either your mode isn't in degrees or you weren't taking the inverse of the correct trig function.